Grading Practices and Student Satisfaction by Dr. Matthew J. Hernando. Okay, so my research topic for this report was the influence of grading practices on student satisfaction with both the courses they take and the instructor teaching them. Let me begin by stating that I'm going to be organizing this presentation around a series of three interrelated questions. First, how does grading influence student perceptions of you as an instructor? Second, should that matter to you? And if so, why? Third, what sort of grading practices will ultimately help you cultivate the kind of perceptions of you and your course that you want your students to have? So those are the three questions I'm going to strive to answer in this presentation. Okay. First, how does grading influence student perceptions of you? My research has shown that grading practices absolutely impact student satisfaction with a course and/or the instructor. The key word here is fairness. One study published in the journal College Teaching has shown that grading practices have a significant influence on student perceptions of instructor fairness. In other words, students regard instructors as fair when they teach what they test over, give them opportunities to prepare for the exam, and adopt the same testing and grading policies for everyone. And fairness is very important to students. Lest anyone be in doubt, students are very concerned about grading fairness. One study, also published in College Teaching, found that students viewed professors who violated basic norms about grading fairness by tolerating cheating or plagiarism, for example, as being more unethical than professors who used illegal narcotics or dated and/or had sex with a student. Another study from the University of Northumbria suggests that when evaluating their school's assessment practices, students are even more concerned about the fairness of an assessment practice, in other words, does it treat students equitably, than they are about actual assessment validity. In other words, does it actually measure what it purports to measure? So, should you care if your students think you are fair? And if so, why? Well, again, the answer is absolutely. You should absolutely care if your students think you are fair in your grading practices. The reason for that is threefold. First, it affects how your students will treat you. If you want to be treated with respect and courtesy by your students, research suggests that one of the most important things you can do is be a fair and consistent grader. On the other hand, if you want your students to disrespect and undermine you, one of the surest ways to do that is to get a reputation as an unfair or inconsistent grader. One study published in Communication Quarterly, for example, reached the conclusion that students were more likely to engage in, quote, indirect interpersonal aggressiveness towards their instructor. In other words, aggressiveness that inflicts harm while avoiding face-to-face interaction, such as spreading rumors, withholding information, reputation destruction, etc., if they viewed their instructor's grading practices as unjust. The same study in Communication Quarterly also reached two other interesting findings. It found that student perceptions of grading fairness also influenced students' reported level of motivation. In other words, they reported being more motivated to work hard when they thought their work was being graded fairly. Similarly, another study in the journal Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education found that poor performing students with negative justice perceptions, in other words, a perception of grading unfairness, were more likely to report lower levels of quote, self-efficacy, or the belief in one's own ability to succeed in difficult situations. In other words, if you receive a bad grade that you can't explain and that you don't think is fair, you're less likely to believe that you can succeed in the future. Finally, the study in Communication Quarterly further found that student perceptions of grading fairness positively influenced, quote, effective learning, end quote. In other words, learning that students have internalized to become a part of how they think, feel, and behave. Effective learning was measured by survey questions which asked students to indicate whether they anticipated applying what they learned in the course of their real life, and whether they were likely to enroll in another course of related content. Finally, we move on to our last question. What sort of grading practices will ultimately help you cultivate the kind of perceptions of you and your course that you want your students to have? In other words, what sort of grading practices will help us maintain the image and hopefully the reality of a fair and just instructor in our students' eyes? To answer that question, we need to address something else, which is that students evaluate an instructor's fairness as a grader based on different notions of justice. What are they? Well, first there is distributive justice. This term refers to, quote, perceptions of the fairness of outcomes received as a result of an allocation decision, end quote. In other words, distributive justice concerns the perceptions that people have about such things as how much money they receive for their labor or what grade they receive as a student. Generally speaking, people assess distributive justice based on a comparison between what they receive, in other words, their money or their grade, and either what they expected to receive, what they felt they deserved, or what others in their situation would have received. So in other words, distributive justice, to put it in a nutshell, it's all about the results. But then there's procedural justice. This term refers to the perceptions that people have about the fairness of the decision-making process that people in positions of power use to make allocation decisions. In the case of grades, that process might include evaluating the quality of a student's work, their classroom participation, their test scores, etc. In any case, it is critical to procedural justice that there be a clearly articulated standard and that that standard is applied evenly to all students. Evenly to all students. And finally, there's something called interactional justice. This type of justice is all about openness, transparency, and being sensitive to students' individual situations. Instructors must be willing to explain why students received the grades that they got, communicate that information respectfully and courteously, and respond to students' concerns about their grade. Now, all of these types of justice matter. They all matter. But from the research that I have done, procedural justice outweighs distributive justice, at least in the minds of most students. Procedural justice outweighs distributive justice. The aforementioned study from Communication Quarterly, for example, found that only student perceptions of procedural justice had a statistically significant impact on student motivation, learning, and aggression. Distributive justice did not. In other words, the students want to receive the results they regard as fair, but it's more important for them to believe that the process is fair. Likewise, the authors of one of the articles in College Teaching emphasize the importance of procedural justice over distributive justice, writing that so-called particularistic grading practices, such as allowing students to do makeup work or replace a test or giving students a chance to make up a bad test, enhance your scores on interactional justice as an instructor, but nothing else, and also help to undermine the consistency principle behind procedural justice. So instead of using grading practices designed to bring up bad scores, they recommend using teaching practices designed to improve performance. In other words, review sessions, study guides, and so on. And finally, here is my works cited slide.